Good evening. I'm Rachel Marston, Associate Director of the Literary Arts Institute of the College of St. Benedict. Welcome to the Spring 2021 semester of our Minnesota Street Reading Series. Tonight, we are joined by Maria Dahvana Headley, whose most recent book is the acclaimed new translation of Beowulf, and who is the Spring 2021 McNeely Creative Writer in Residence. Note, in residence has an asterisk here due to the pandemic. Maria Dahvana Headley's brain is one in which I would take up residence, if her written work is evidence of the landscape of her mind and its inhabitants, a strange and wild place. A few brief notes about what you might encounter in her work. A couple making gifts of remnants of their body parts in a post-apocalyptic world overtaken by parasitic worms. Sky pirates who plunder Earth's crops and whose voices in song are able to command the elements. The library of the low, where knowledge from lost and forbidden books is tattooed on the skin of the librarians. Or Dana Mills, war vet returned home to birth and raise her son Gren beneath the mountain outside the suburban development of Harriet Hall, and the questions her novel raises about the ways we conceive of motherhood and monsterhood. Whether in memoir, speculative fiction, historical fiction, translation, and more, Headley's writing demonstrates a brain on fire with language and its myriad possibilities. But always, at the ripe, beating heart of each piece, are explorations about longing, desire, and power. While such explorations pervade much of her work, Headley's recent translation of Beowulf makes this especially evident. She approaches her translation with a glee that has you racing through the pages, offering us bro in lieu of hark or lo or listen to get us to lean into the story. This bro is informed by, as she writes in her introduction to the book, sitting at the bar's end, listening to men navigate darts, trivia, and women. This is just one way that Headley signals that this translation will ask us to consider and question the interpretive acts of previous translations and the mythologies that have sprung up around Beowulf the man and the text itself. Headley's introduction and translation ask, why does a grieving woman with power, her own hall, warrior skills, continually get cast as monstrous? Her translation also challenges narrative about heroism and heroic whiteness. A quotation from her novel, The Mere Wife, help us consider the categories of hero and monster. She writes, "The world is not large enough for monsters and heroes at once. There's too much danger of confusion between the two." Headley's Beowulf shows us this danger again and again, that the line between hero and the monster is thin, if even real, shows us the terrible costs of heroic masculinity defined by war and vengeance, reveals to us, to quote again from her introduction, that there are also stories that haven't yet been reckoned with, stories hidden within stories we think we know. Maria will read to us tonight from both Beowulf and The Mere Wife, followed by a conversation. If you have a question that you would like to ask, be sure to add it to the YouTube chat. And without further ado, please welcome Maria Dahvana Headley.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here tonight and to be here in my little corner right now, but a beautiful corner because I know that I am virtually in residence in Minnesota. I'm going to read to you, yes, from The Mere Wife and from Beowulf, and I'm going to read two scenes, basically. I'm going to read in The Mere Wife. The Mere Wife is an adaptation of Beowulf set in contemporary America, and it's from the women's POV. So this is a section from the POV of the Grendel's mother character, who is named Dana Mills. She's a war veteran living in a cave on a mountain with her son Gren. And her son Gren is very interested in Harriet Hall, which is a subdivision, a gated community down the mountain. And then I'll read the section that in the plot sort of just follows, which is Gren going down and into Hiratal, or Grendel in the case of the poem. So this will be a kind of long reading. I've never done this reading before. This is a new reading for me, and an exciting one, because this was the dream when I started working on this project, to investigate the female characters in Beowulf, and then I decided to translate it. And I've never done a reading where I read in sequence two pieces of the plot. So this is exciting. Listen, it's time for church. Bells are ringing from below, this fat, homesick sound that makes me think about everything I've ever seen at this time of year, good and bad. A skinny little plastic tree in a parking lot when I was 13, a red nose in the desert when I was 23, a rose on a motel sign when I was 24, and I'm confused for a moment before I remember that it must be Christmas. It snowed during the night and everything is blanketed. The world feels safer against logic, and I feel summoned, like I might get up and run down the mountain to church now, after everything I've been and done. I haven't been to church since I was 17. And the church I went to then is gone underneath Harrod Hall like everything else. Instead, I check traps, the ones in the darkest part of the trees where no one can see me from below. Nothing in them. I need a bird or a rabbit. Gren's still fast asleep, and so I watch Harrod through the scope on my weapon. I'm not aiming at them, I'm just looking. I haven't killed a human since Gren was born. Before that, I killed 10. That was my count. Maybe someone else's is different. 7 years ago, I woke up in a hospital that wasn't really a hospital. My guns were gone, but when I got out of there running, I climbed into my friend Bobby's parents' barn in Nebraska. Hollow hoarding under a plank, couple $100, some naked pictures of women I didn't know, some MREs, Bobby's M4 carbine and Beretta M9. Man was ready for any just in case. Bless you, Bobby, rest in peace. They're up high on a ledge, originally out of reach of Gren, except now he's tall enough to touch anything he wants. I've tried to teach him about danger, but he also knows how to load and fire. I needed him to know. There are emergency weapons in a situation like this. I don't use either of them to shoot, but I keep them clean. I'm trying to figure out what Gren sees in the people below us, and it's obvious. They have so many things. Everything down there is brightly colored and bountiful. Up here, rocks, sticks, rabbits. The wall-sized TV is on. There are balloon animals parading down the middle of an avenue somewhere. Is there a Christmas parade now? I don't see a child and I don't see a husband, just the wife dressed, making coffee. The parade she's watching is a parade of grinning giants. I saw a parade once that was all puppets with bloody mouths. That seemed more right to me, the way sticks moved them, the way they cast long shadows on the sand, and beneath the shadows, little creatures scrambled, trying to get out of the sun. She brings a bird out of the refrigerator, a goose plucked by someone else. I watch her at the counter with a knife, opening it up, putting her hands into it, blood in the sink. She's stuffing this bird, and I'm up here with my son, feeding him what tonight? The cat is turning on the spit, and no fat is dripping. There's a squirrel, too, not safe in its den, but roasting in ours. There's the boy in snow gear. He looks very small, but that's because I'm used to Gren. I think about how a mother made him. I've been a house like that for more than just my son. I've been a warm room for voices that shout and scream and tell me they're trying to surrender. I saw a baby blow up in its mother's arms when I was over there. A soldier touched its face and the baby cooed and the soldier gave it a kiss. Everybody died, mother, child, soldier. All the soldiers' guys died but one, and I watched that guy running crazy out from a black and white place in the dirt. I saw a lot of movies played in a tent. That thing, the bomb, the baby, the last guy running, it might have been in a movie. One time I threw a beer bottle at a sheet stretched between two buildings and cried during a preview for something stupid I figured I'd never live to see. That's the last time I remember watching anything on a screen. I think about what Gren would know if his world weren't the size of our cave. He could see what the world really looks like, what the world really is like. The fossil trees, the ones around this mountain, those trees were never hung with ropes, but that's only because humans didn't exist when those trees were alive. Down in the tunnels off the main station, there are things from a century back, people using it before us. People hid here. There's a trunk with a jacket with a high collar, something made of dark fabric, blood-stained. A dress made of calico covered in mud at the hem, a paisley shawl, a christening gown embroidered with flowers, for some baby gone now 100 years. If you leave things long enough, they stop belonging to anyone but the place they're in. When I was little, I had a doll my mother found in the caves on this mountain, small bones carved and strung together. My son has a rock with a fossil inside it, and that came from someone else to me, and from me to him. Discarded things can get used again, sometimes for love. When I get back to our cave, I find Gren's toys on the floor. Stick dolls, each one tied together with string, each one broken into twig bits. Men he's killed, men he's made. He's killed them and I don't know why. I don't know what game he was playing, who he was angry at. Mommy, he says. He's never said that before. He has a doll in his hand. I watch him crush it and then throw it off the edge of the cave lip into the water we can't see. Something makes a sound down there. I'm looking at his spine, the sleek bones beneath his skin, made by my body, those bones, and sometimes I'm broken by that too, the idea that this person came from me. I feel broken mostly, but I brought him into this world and here he is. We look down into the dark together and something large splashes, a heaving up out of water, a slopping onto stone. Gren, I say back to him, all is well and will be well. No. He looks up at me and his eyes flash in the dark. I'm not right, Gren says. I don't look right. What do you look like? I ask him. You look like yourself. He shakes his head. He crushes another stick man in his fist and it cuts his palm. Drops of blood fall from Gren's hand and down into the dark water. The creature's keen. Stop that, I say. They're hungry, Gren says, and flings another drop of blood down. He had 30 men here made out of sticks. Now there are only 28. I played with the boy from down there, my son says, not looking at me. You said there were monsters. My heart starts pounding and I calm it as quickly as I can. I can't scare him. I have to get him to tell me. Only one person, I say, my voice even, calm. Just him. Did you go down the mountain? I played in the snow with him. He says he's not a monster. Did anyone else see you? There's something else in his hand. I've been seeing it glittering, not thinking about it, and finally I know what it is. A Christmas bow, the kind that sticks onto a package. I'd forgotten something like that even existed. Gren brings out a box wrapped in colorful paper. To Dylan, from Santa. He gave me a present, Gren says, and his mood has changed. Now he's happy. He looks up at me. Can I keep it? He thinks his loneliness is gone forever, but this is the thing that happens right before you learn that even though you love someone, they might not love you back. Is this how it is in the world for every parent? You follow your son, you wait outside your house when he doesn't come home, hoping there's a God out there paying attention to you. Or you wait for your daughter. You look in the windows of cars and houses, knowing you could lose your children in a second if you let down your guard at all. This is nothing new. The world is the world. My world is worse than that one, but not by much. I think of the little boy in his bare pajamas, the way he's running around his Christmas tree, his parents, the things he's going to tell them about my son. I think about that little boy and I feel my heart fill with grief, with end of the world, because now I know who I have to kill. Hidden by fog, Grendel roved the moors, God-cursed, grudge worsening. He knew who he hunted, wine-drunk, mead-met men, and he pined for his prey. Under storm clouds he stalked them in his usual anguish, feeling a forbidden hearth, that gilded hill atop the hall gleaming still through years of bloodshed. This was not the first time he'd hunted in Hrothgar's hall, but never before nor later had he such hard luck. No one worthy had historically lain in wait. The warrior worked his way toward the war, his head and heart hurting, and arrived at the iron-crossed door. Its hinges howled a welcome, and his rage ratcheted up. He flung the hatch wide and leapt into the mead room, over decorated floors, into the hold fury frothing. His heart crowed as he counted them, man by man, nested together, roosting like roasting chickens. He'd be the sort of fox that stalks the night, eat his fill, no coo remaining, no bill, only feathers. Loose on the floor. Before sunrise, he planned to prize souls from skeletons. His word, though, would no longer be writ in others' blood, red footprints to the door and out, the moors, the mere. No. Tonight was the night Grendel's goose would be cooked, his funeral banquet bruised and blue. Fervid and flexing, faking sleep, Higelac servant spied from his bench, scanning slit-eyed the long-haunted hall, awaiting the hunted hunter. At last his enemy struck, snatching a sleeper, sucking him bone dry, staining the pale planks red, grunting, gobbling, gnawing him limb from limb, here a throat, here a head, fingers, feet, dead. Hands outstretched to slaughter a second, Grendel dropped his first course, spotting the bed where Beowulf slept. He gripped that sleeper, though, and found himself conscripted, his own hand grabbed by a commanding Geat. The grasp began the tear that would take Grendel out, rendering him a revenant in the hall he'd always reveled in. His bones cracked, but he could not wrestle free from the clasp, war-wedded to a woe-bringer who clung like no human ever clung, keeping him close. Grendel was an unwilling draftee, never bested before nor held hostage. Now Higelac's man, chanting the boasts he'd made his bedrime, climbed from the covers to get a better grip. Knuckles buckled, joints unjoined. The attacker became the attacked, racked with pain, attempting to escape, to race from hall to fens his hidden highways. His own grasp unlatched, his fleshlocks loosened, try though he might to divest himself of Hewett and return home, dive into the dark and abide with any awful thing there, stay in stealthy health the rest of his days. The room shook. Benches splintered, and Danes dreamt of doom or quivered, questioning. The warriors wrestled, muscles bulging and raged, screaming for their lives, and the hall trembled but stayed standing, its design fit for fighting. The wooden walls crossed with iron bands, a forest fettered together. Though from what I've heard, the mead benches stood on end and shattered, gold sigils no match for battle. The two fighters fought on in the rubble. I mean, damn, man, until this night, no shielding would have believed the hall could be felled by anything but flame, its ivory and iron, its careful cantilevers. Tonight, though, it risked timbering. A wailing clamor rose again, echoing over the confines, and the North Danes listened to the sound of doom's hammer, instability building a home in the hearts of those who heard it. The whole hill quaked with the shriek of that almighty abrogate, the loner's lament, handcuffed by hopelessness, losing to an unforeseen leader. The warrior holding him was stronger than any monster, more muscular than any man. That stalwartest of soldiers had no wish to imprison the invader, only to slay him. Grendel's life wasn't worth living, and Beowulf had decided to end it. His own men stood too as the unarmed enemies swung heirloom blades willy-nilly, though really their captain needed no safekeeping. They swung for the slayer's soul, but their struggle was for naught. They could have stayed sleeping rather than fought, or merely watched the battle, for their swords, sharp as they were, couldn't injure the fiend. His spells warded him, annealing his skin. Still, his death would be agony. The world clung to his fingers, and life leaving wouldn't be swift. No existence snuffing instantaneous gift, but sickly slow suffering, his sinning spirit sent to sink slowly down to hell. He knew it now, he who'd spent seasons haunting this hall, preying on poets, bringing pain to the privileged. infuriating the Almighty. His body was breached. Its bones were breaking. Helak's kinsmen had him hand-welded. Each of them living cancelled out the other as Cain had Abel, brother unbrothered. Grendel's shoulder split, tendons twisting, arteries unscrolled, his limb worried from him, bested by fatal fists. Beowulf the winner, Grendel dismissed. He ran then for his grave still living. He rushed to the water, wound-weeping lair, his last longing. His hourglass was emptying now, his days done, and he knew it. Each heartbeat wrote its number in red, and the Ringdanes were delivered of their wretch with a ring. This enemy was dead. Thank you.
Thank you,
Maria.
Yes. Sorry,
I think we're.
We'll let Maria get plugged into her headset for our conversation.
Yes.
Thank you so much. What a
Thank you.
pleasure to hear you read from two very different approaches to Beowulf, but clearly informed by the same sensibility. I would love for you, I know you write about this in the introduction to Beowulf, but knowing that not all members of our audience will know, if you could talk a little bit how you came to the project of translating the text and its relationship then to the work you did on The Mere Wife.
Yes. So I'd had the idea years ago to adapt Beowulf into this contemporary novel and to tell it from the point of view of the women who don't get POV in the poem at all. There's only one woman who gets a voice at all in the poem. So I was like, okay, well, that's an obvious thing to do. And I felt like I knew how to do it. And I did. I wrote the novel and got it finished. And it was getting ready to come out, and I did a reading for it at the World Fantasy Conference. And two women in the audience who had been jurists for the World Fantasy Award, which I didn't win, but they came to my reading, and they raised their hand at the end of the Q&A after I had done a reading from The Mere Wife and said, well, I was talking at length about translations, about all the translations that I'd read and the research I'd done, and they said, well, when is your translation coming out? And, it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not. And I was like, no, I'm not translating this. This is not happening. I'm done with Beowulf. I thought that I was finished. But then I thought about it for about 3 days, and I thought, well, maybe I am. Maybe that's what's actually going on in the back of my brain. Maybe I've been working on this translation behind my own back for a while. And I had the idea to tell a very different POV in this case. The POV of the poem is sort of macho poet talking to his boys, and a guy at the end of the bar telling a kind of drunk bro story. And I had that feeling when I had read the poem, that's how the poem felt to me. And it was one of the reasons that I felt rebellious and wanted to tell it from the women's point of view. But going into the translation, I thought, okay, well, that translation also doesn't really exist. There isn't a translation out there that has that sense of, really of a personality for the narrator, and also a style for the narrator's storytelling that is in a contemporary vernacular. So I went to my editor for The Mere Wife, Sean McDonald at FSG at MCD, and said, I know this is a crazy idea, but what if I just did a translation of Beowulf, and I'll just do it really fast, don't even worry, it'll be fine. And in my mind, I was going to do it in a very swift fashion. I thought, okay, it'll come out with the paperback of Mere Wife. It'll take me 3 months. And I was crazy. And it did not. It took me much longer. It took, not horrible, but it took me about a year. And it came out, the translation came out last summer in August, about 2 years after The Mere Wife came out. So not bad, but not a 3-week translation like I arrogantly believed for a moment of complete bonkersness.
But it's interesting because it was evident when you were reading it aloud, and I had the same experience in reading Beowulf on the page too, is the vernacular that you use is, and that feeling of the tale telling, which is clearly so much a part of Beowulf, but it has all that energy, right? Like you just, like it keeps its momentum throughout. And I think a part of that is a testament to this contemporary feel that you've given it, and this narrative persona that comes into the text now too. Something I was also thinking about as you were talking, and this came up some in your introduction as well, about translating. So this is there's a couple parts to this question. So one, translating Beowulf in this contemporary moment. So in part, what, thinking about access or obstacles, right? To you write in the introduction, until recently it was cotton-gloved privilege to view the original manuscript of Beowulf. So you're talking about the democratization of information, but also in this way in which that, especially of these, what we might think of as foundational Western canon texts, right, and even the language of Western, that there's been an assumption of what kind of credentials someone needs to have to even to approach them in some ways. So I was wondering if you might speak about that.
Yes. I had my own level of feeling about it in terms of feeling like I wasn't qualified to touch this text when I started. I didn't feel like I couldn't write a novel about it because John Gardner had written Grendel, and I thought, well, somebody did it already. And lots of women have translated Beowulf, but most of them come from an academic background. There are some who don't, but most of them do. So it's so for me, I was like coming in from not only outside of the kind of academic ivory tower, but outside of that field completely. I was coming in as a novelist and as a storyteller and playwright, but which is not the same as the by and large group of people who have translated Beowulf over the years. Most people who've done it have been very scholarly credentialed. And I wasn't. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to even touch this text. Because it's also very important. People spend whole careers just studying Beowulf and sometimes just studying small bits of Beowulf. And, I have a little bit of a hot fire rage against notions of canon and how skinny the canon tends to be, because it just seems fully arbitrary to me. It annoys the shit out of me, to be blunt. And so I've always been like, okay, let's expand the canon. It needs to be expanded. It's not telling the whole story of the history of story, nor is it telling the whole story of the history of humanity. It's telling just often this skinny little segment of a certain kind of person, but not everybody. And here we all are. We've always been here. I mean, everybody's always been here. This isn't a situation where there have been only academic white men in the world for the entire history of humans. And in fact, that's a very skinny slice of the population. So I have always thought, okay, let's spread apart the lines of the canonical texts and see what else might be in there and look at them from different angles. And I think that to look at something like this from outside of academia, but also from outside of the narrower set of people who have translated this text, means that I could look at it from a different angle, which is, and sometimes I say I can look at it from underneath, because that's where I am in terms of the kind of person that normally has translated this. I'm like under them. And but that's interesting. There's interesting stuff under there, I have to say. Like, I could look at it as a text that was a more populist text, and as a text that was something that was meant to be told to audiences full of people who would not all have been going, ooh, what's the meter? Is he getting the meter right? Do we have the entire verse knowledge of the history that's referenced in this poem? And as an audience in the time that this poem was being performed, and I think as many people do, that this was a transcription of an oral performance of this poem, but we don't even know when this poem was written. It's we have like a 300-year span of time during which the poem might have been written, and then it was written down in about suddenly my brain, about the 1025-ish, or a little bit before that. But before that, we have like 300 years of possibilities of somebody working on this poem, and maybe many people working on this poem, and delivering different references depending on what was in the room, and who was in the room, and who had an aunt in that war, and who had an uncle. And, we don't know who the poet was. We don't know if the poet was... We don't know the gender of the poet. We don't know the background of the poet. We don't know the race of the poet. We don't know any of those things. And anything is possible. As any writer knows, invention is a wide span. You can invent a lot of things and make them seem as though they happened, and maybe they didn't. So we don't have a sense of that really. We have a sense of guess. But if you're a person who writes fiction for a living, you have I think maybe a wider sense of guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that. I mean, I think the like opening up the ambiguity, and that makes me think of that final quote from your introduction that I used in my introduction for the event about like all of these. This is me paraphrasing it, but all of these possibilities, these stories that we haven't even explored, and the stories within the stories, right? Which is clearly what the Mirrorwife is doing, but that you've also opened up conversation with in your translation of Beowulf. Which is so exciting, I think. And
Yeah, I mean, I did that on purpose because I read many translations where my questions weren't answered. And, you know, there's the thing where you're supposed to have questions. This is a text from a world that we're not part of anymore. And it's in a language that we don't speak anymore. So, of course, there are questions and there are things that are mysterious to us. But also, I think that means that the possibilities are also a wide range of things that we can be pointed at in translation and go, ooh, what's under there? Like that's a question. Whereas for me, often in translation, reading this text, I've often felt like the questions had been answered for me and answered in such a way that they made the text skinnier and more narrow than it had actually been in the Old English. So I really felt an urge to re-expand it.
well, and I think particularly with Grendel's mother and the ways that you translate her, might you speak a little bit then about the language, both then the Old English and the language that we have and the ways that's been translated, and then your conception of the possibilities for Grendel's mother then in your translation of Beowulf?
Yes. So one of the things that caused me to write The Mirrorwife was that I was researching Beowulf. I was, as you do, apparently, if you're thinking of what you're going to write your novel about. And I was looking at the way that Grendel's mother had transformed in translation over the years. And she had gotten increasingly monstrous. Like she starts out not described. She's not physically described in the original poem. Her son does do monstrous things. Her son eats people. He comes in. He has superpowers. He's really strong. But so does Beowulf. So there's that. And in translation, usually what happens is that Beowulf is definitely depicted as a heroic human man, and Grendel is depicted as a definite monster. And Grendel's mother just gets kind of tilted alongside Grendel as an obvious monster. And so sometimes translators add things to it to make her more monstrous. They make her fingernails claws. They make her ugly demon hag, for example, which is not language that occurs in the original. And in reality, the same word is used, and this is kind of what inspired The Mirrorwife, the same word is used for Beowulf and for Grendel's mother and for Grendel and for the dragon. And it's a word that in the sort of early dictionaries was translated for Beowulf as hero and for Grendel's mother as monster or as female monster. And really it just probably means formidable, or in my more blunt terms, badass. It's somebody who's really good at what they do, and intimidatingly so. And I think that for a lot of people, especially at the early translations of this text, the more popular ones taking place in the Victorian era and on, it was just really hard to imagine a single mother who could take up weapons and fight and not have her be a monster. Like, that was just something that was not, from the translation perspective, not something that was imaginable for them. Despite the long history of female warriors in literature that exists. Like, it's not like this is the first female warrior that we've ever seen. There is, for example, in the Aeneid, there's Camilla. Camilla is a warrior. And there are women who, like, sort of Valkyric women doing that sort of thing all the time. But this is, we're thinking about Victorian men, and they're like, oh, single mother, ooh, no father mentioned. We don't even know who the dad of this guy is. So clearly the monster traits come through the woman. And we have a long history of that kind of assessment of female characters that is a long tradition in literature as well. The sort of monster descending from the sin of the woman is a pretty classic trope that we have with our other religion, patriarchy. So I always want to crack things like that open. When I see something that is so obviously sexism that got applied to the situation and then became part of the story because the sexism made sense, I'm like, maybe let's just like go and peel that back and see what's underneath that, and see if underneath there's actually a clawed monster who's ugly, or if that was just something that someone who was nervous added to her description.
Yeah,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did not mean to cut you off. I think that nervousness too makes me think about there's a theorist who writes about monstrosity, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who has this really amazing Monster 7 thesis. And I was thinking a lot about one of his theses is that monsters police the borders of the possible. And so the way we categorize people or groups as monstrous is much like what you're talking about. It's like to sort of contain the danger. If we turn them into monsters, right, it creates this, is able to occupy this binary then of sort of good and bad. And so I think that especially with gender is so striking. And then thinking about the Mere Wife, right, how we get this then contrast between Dana Mills and Willa Harriet, right, and the fierceness of both of their approaches to motherhood, but that are very different too, right? But trying to maintain some kind of control as well as these very different expectations about what it means to be a woman in this contemporary world.
Yeah, in the novel, I divided Grendel in half. I made Grendel, Gren, and Dylan. And Dylan lives in the suburb, and Grendel lives in the mountain in a cave with his mother. And Dylan lives in the suburb with his mother, who is essentially based on Wealhtheow, who is Hrothgar's wife. But she is also, because I divided Grendel in half, she's also Grendel's mother. So I was thinking about the nature of protective maternity and of the history of like war culture, which we've always been in. We've just never left a war culture. So I was like, okay, so the history of humans is mothers saying goodbye to sons all the time and having to bury sons. And Beowulf is full of that. The women in the Beowulf poem do that through the whole poem. And when we get an intimate understanding of them, that's often what we're watching. So I was interested in watching that, but I also made the Grendel and Dylan characters younger. I made them small children to sort of highlight their vulnerability and to highlight the fact that they are going into a society that doesn't want either of them, really, and doesn't have safety for either of them, but has a lot of privilege for one of them and none for the other. And just to talk about, I wanted to talk about America. I wanted to talk about the divisions that we make because of differences and transgressions, or perceived or imagined transgressions, and the idea that we can create a monster out of that. And then the monster can be killed and it's fine, and indeed heroic, which is exactly what we see in the Beowulf story as well. So it's a long-standing thing that we've done as humans. We've often created monsters when we had a need to get status within a culture, and we're like, oh, the best way to get status is to fight something horrific, something so horrible, something that no one else can fight. And, most of the time that's another person, even throughout the history of humanity. So we have a long and problematic history of murder and of monsterizing our neighbors.
Thank you. We've got a question from Matt Harkins, who you've met. Beowulf is a story from over 1,000 years ago in which wealth is built and defended through violence. How did it affect the way you think about our contemporary moment, particularly when we're writing The Mere Wife?
Well, it is our contemporary moment. Like, we have not changed. Some things have changed, but not those things. Like, we're still, I was really thinking about sort of capitalist American society and thinking about the ways in which we accumulate hoards and say, this is my hoard. If you step anywhere near my hoard, I'm allowed to kill you. And, that could be any sort of thing. That could be if you need something and you take it from the edge of where I think my boundaries are, I can kill you. And I think that so much of our society is built on that concept that we have justified hoarding and indeed lauded hoarding, which means that we have a population where we have just this very small amount of people who have all the money and all of the hoard, and then a whole lot of people who are struggling and are seen as potential monsters, but also servant warriors for the people who have all the money. Because in the American society, we also have a mythological dream that says you can rise up, you can build from nothing, you too can have a hoard. And so you don't want to remove your possibility of hoarding by transgressing, because if you transgress, then you're a monster. So we have also a very big societal problem where we have the people on the bottom defending the top, so that the top is somewhere they can still get to, refusing to engage in any thinking about equality and thinking that that's unfair for people to actually have equal rights. The whole society is built on it. It's a big problem. It's a poisonous aspect of our society, and one that has lots of historical precedent, which doesn't mean anything about it is correct. It just means that there's lots of room, and nasty room, to use it as justification, to use these stories in that way. One of the reasons I like to work on these stories is that I like to break them open and look at what else is inside of them to show us the cost of that and the weight of it, the problems with it. Because I think lots of those things are also braided into the stories.
Yes, I mean, even in often how we approach narrative structure and our understanding of the forms in which stories should be told, let alone who is able to voice them. So I think these are really important questions. I was also thinking, as you were just talking about, oh no, I may have lost my thought in that moment. I was thinking about heroic individualism as well, on behalf of the community, but that as you were thinking about, talking about this hoarding, because I think there is tied to the narrative and the mythology of the American dream and being able to rise up, but is also this attachment to rugged individualism, which also, as somebody who is also from the Mountain West, for me is often located geographically in the United States to the narrative of the West and the mythology of the West too. So I apologize, this may not be a question, it might just be a reflection. But if you want to pick anything up from that.
I can talk about that a little bit. I can, I'm from Idaho. I'm from a place where people really engage with the hard-bitten mountain kind of culture, and also the difficult, some of it is a difficult place to live. The place I'm from is a difficult place to live. Lots of people, settlers, died there as they were traveling over because there's just no water and it was hard to travel. We also killed a lot of people as we were on our way over, and I think that we have such I think that the society is built in such a denialist, that's not really a word, but I'm going to make it up, format, that we're okay, we're not going to talk about what we did. We're just going to talk about how hard it was. And it was hard, and we did some terrible things. I say we, but I'm really talking about my ancestors, because my people came over, some of them came over on the Mayflower. In my family history, there are people going, we fought our way across the country. And but not really talking about against people who lived there because the land was occupied. And this is something that recurs throughout classical literature. We see instances like this. We see it in Beowulf, in my opinion. Grendel and his mother they're there already when Hrothgar comes. And they are already established. And Hrothgar says, I'm going to build the most beautiful hall, the greatest hall, the celebratory hall that celebrates how we have a special connection with God, and it's our land, we're God's people, or the God's people. And, they have an idea that anyone who is there before them doesn't belong there and isn't allowed there. And this is, of course, we have exactly the same idea built into American culture. And it is poisonous. And in the case of the Beowulf story, I think Grendel is very justified in feeling upset by people partying all night next to his house. Like, he's there already. And it's beautiful, and it's the wilderness, and it's quiet. And then suddenly everybody is drinking and barfing outside his door, you know? We see things like that all the time too. Like, this is not a new kind of interaction. And it is a justified reaction to feel transgressed upon when someone builds something toxic next to you. You know, and my sympathy is pretty much often, very frequently, it's with the monsters, because the monsters are the ones who don't get the POV. And I'm always like, well, if you don't get the POV, there's something interesting about you, I'm going to look. And usually what you're looking at is a monster that is, to some extent or another, has been transgressed against and has been invented by whatever the ruling class is, whatever the class is that gets to tell the story.
Well, and it also allows for this greater complexity or cracking open, as you've been talking about. We have another question from the audience, from Adele. In your work, I've noticed you seem to view both genres as equally expansive. How did you come to that perspective? Can you talk about how and why you decided to start blending sci-fi, fantasy, and history?
Yes. Yeah, I just think it's all one pile of stories. I as a kid, I was reading my way through the whole library. I would get to go to the library, which was a distance, and we would go once every couple of weeks, and I would go in and just buzz through, grabbing as much as I could, as fast as I could, and then just taking it home without regard to category or genre, or, you know, I didn't know what I liked. And so, I mean, I did know what I liked. I liked everything. And I've always felt that way. And I've always felt, so when I discovered that there were categories and that there were shelves that were like, here's the, you know, here's the corner where the science fiction lives, and here's the corner where the history lives. I'm like, well, aren't they the same thing though? They're just opposite ends. But here's the history and here's the future. So why aren't they in the same corner? Like, it's the same thing, really. The imagining of, because you're imagining history too. I mean, you're not there. You have to imagine it. You can imagine it with a bunch of tools, just as you can kind of imaginarily predict the future with a bunch of tools. But I feel like the whole history of storytelling contains fantastical elements. It contains explanations for weather events that are often like, God just rained frogs. I don't know. I don't know what happened. There were dragons that day. And, you know, throughout the sort of canonical classic stuff like the Odyssey, there are monsters, there are witches, magic exists. And then that becomes the guts of literature. So only very recently did we get to a point where we were like, there's literature. And literature doesn't contain like wild, crazy stuff. But it always has before that. and really, like, the entire history of humans telling stories is, oh my God, what's on the outside of the dark around the fire out there in the woods is something that you can't even imagine. But I'm going to try to explain it to you and give you a lush sense of what it would feel like to be scared of something that you can't quite imagine or think about or see. So yeah, I mean, to me, it always seemed very natural to blend all those categories up and like make books out of them. But it has not always felt natural to other people. It's been, my career has been like pretty wide ranging because I've written in lots of genres and I've mashed lots of genres together and like grabbed interesting facts from the entire history of humans and also interesting forms from the entire history of humans. And I'm always just looking for something new to play with because I like to play. So sometimes people have been like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it like this? This is not how it's done. You have to choose the genre and like choose a lane and go in that lane and don't be all over the road like this. And I'm like, oh, I'm not even on the road now. I'm like off-road and going into, you know, the mirror. But to me, that seems like a very normal thing to do if you look at the whole history of people telling stories. Like, you know, Ovid did it. Like, any Ovid that you read looks like that. And any ancient texts that you read are like, well, then I just invented that they could fly. And suddenly there's an ointment that's flying ointment. Or there's like, you know, I think it's like the urge to tell an interesting story for me trumps all form concerns or genre concerns. I'm like, if there's something cool and interesting over here and I could use it, then I'm going to use it if I can use it. Like it makes for a joyful career. I guess I have a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, and that is, it's apparent in you talking about it, it's apparent in your work. And I think it speaks to, I think, many of the things that you address formally and theoretically in Beowulf and in The Mere Wife, but this idea of also too, like, well, why do we have to have permission to do it in a particular way? Like, these are also structures that have been invented to sort of contain, right? And what happens when we break out like the monster from those. We've got a question from Lindsay. You talk about empathizing more with a monster in a story or what they symbolically represent. In this regard, have you drawn inspiration from the writer or director Guillermo del Toro?
Not particularly, but I think we work in the same realm. I've seen some of his work and I've liked it, but it's not like it's not the stuff that I saw that first inspired me. It's stuff that I see and I'm like, oh, hello, hi, buddy. We're doing the same stuff. We like to play with the same toys. Like, I feel like we hang out on the same playground and we would probably like each other if we hung out because he is also interested in empathizing with the interior of that perspective, of the perspective of being monsterized, of the perspective of actually being different and being misunderstood. And I think a lot of his work is about that. It's about the divide of like the misunderstanding of sort of larger populations. And, you know, I'm interested in that too. I'm interested in how to craft empathy in a society where it isn't taught to us. So that is everything to do with monsters.
No, absolutely. Monsters. I'm very invested in monsters too, and representations of monsters. And I think that what the strange and the fantastic also open up, in addition to the power of storytelling, is I think that it's sometimes for readers too, but as writers, like gives us access to a different way to approach some of these concerns, right? And our contemporary concerns. I am just thinking about, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We've got time for at least one more question. So I have a text I received from a colleague as a question. So sorry, that's why I'm looking over to the side of my screen. She writes, also, quote, if you leave some things long enough, they stop belonging to anyone but the place, is a quote from the first reading that sticks with me as a metaphor for ancient stories. So I guess that was more of a comment than a quotation, but again, than a question. If you leave some things long enough, they stop belonging to anyone but the place. But could you talk about that idea?
Yeah, I would like to talk about that idea because that's really how I feel. I feel like, you know, the history of the world is just what we told about it. It's not like it's not like we have all of the information, but it is, in my opinion, like people talk a lot about the problems in the text that we have, the historic text that we have. People talk about how they leave a lot of people out, and that's true. We have a very redacted corpus of history because things have gotten burned, things have gotten lost on purpose, things have gotten crushed down because the tellers weren't allowed to have support on any level, institutionally, societally. They weren't allowed to publish, and there was no publishing, and their work just got taken away, or it was in an oral tradition and it went away, it got whispered down. So I think that the stories that we have, the ones that we have written or that lived, that lasted, belong to all of us. Like it's they belong to all of us, and their problems belong to all of us, their gaps belong to all of us. We're allowed to go into them and go, there's something missing, and I'm gonna talk about it. I think that to regard them as somehow holy and not belonging to everyone, and only belonging to people who have done intense work to study them, and those people, it belongs to those people too. But I think that we have such a long tradition of exclusion in terms of who's allowed to tell the story publicly, and we are having a moment now where access has improved, like for a lot of people, and a lot of people who have never traditionally been in the like sort of larger public radius, standing in the center saying, I'm telling the story now there's a possibility that could happen, and it should happen. Like, it should happen with these old texts, because the old texts that we have that are the memory of the society are missing big memories. They're missing big chunks of perspective. They're missing big chunks of, like, really, in my opinion, they're missing joy. They're missing, like, the joy of being a person who isn't just for the plot's purposes a murdered wife. The joy of being a person who isn't just for the plot's purposes a monster. Like, we can look deeper and expand those identities and think about our history as humans, which has always been as complicated as it is now. We have never lived like a narrow, uncomplicated existence on this planet. And one would think that we had if we were just going to, like, reduce the history of storytelling down to only some people ever had thoughts of story, only some people had an urge to tell story, when in fact in all cultures and in all genders and in all sexual orientation, everybody has always told stories. Like, the big thing about being human is that we tell stories to each other. So yes, I think the things like this, that, like Beowulf, things like the Odyssey, things like, there are many more examples, but I think they belong to everybody. And they are, I think they're open for interpretation and open for turning it upside down and inside out and going, what's in there? Let's see. I just think that that's part of the joyful work of telling a more expansive and more interesting history. More interesting, more exciting, more thrilling. More full of grief, too. I mean, like, the history of pain is there, and that's something that has not been talked about as much as it should have been talked about. Because if we would talk about it, we would have it as part of our history, then maybe we could learn how to make better choices. And I think pushing the works that explain the history of sacrifice, of loss, and of disastrous events culturally would really help in terms of being part of the universal story corpus. If we were like, and then here's the story of how this happened again. Does it have to keep happening like this again? Instead of just erasing those stories over and over.
Yes, and what happens if we reimagine those narratives? And we have another question from the audience. Well, we have a few other questions, and I think we might be able to get to a couple of them, but I'm also keeping an eye on the time for everyone and for you. One is, could you speak about how or if you had to subvert some of the traditional hierarchies of concerns in your particular translation process? In other words, did your primary concern or experience as a fiction writer allow you to translate with different parameters?
Yes. I translated this as a person who was really interested in clarity of story. I was like, okay, let's see what this story tells us about being human. That's what I'm primarily interested in. And I am also really interested in modes of storytelling that reckon with the way memory works and the way that that humans repeat at story points. And so I was so as a translator, there were two things that I was really thinking about here. And I was thinking about, like, okay, how can I make it so this story feels as exciting as it should? Because I think it's an exciting and interesting story, but it sometimes doesn't feel that way in translation. Sometimes it's like, uh-oh, here's a long list of names. And here's a digression that doesn't really quite make sense. And I had that feeling too. Like, even as I was working on certain parts of it, I was like, now we're at that part. I don't know what happens here. I don't understand it. I'm lost. But because of my fiction career, I have a lot of experience of crafting difficult stories, I guess, and of wrangling with difficult material where you're like, uh-oh, no, the story just suddenly ends. Well, okay, here we are. And it was something I was really thinking about translating this was trying to get to not the literal translation of Beowulf. Like, I wasn't working on that. That was something that people have done it. I've read them. Like, it's not something that doesn't exist. I was looking at trying to do a translation that felt exciting, like it would feel to hear this story for the first time in a room where a storyteller was telling the story. And so that meant that as my fiction skills were part of it, because I was really thinking about the character of the storyteller. I was really thinking about the kinds of words that an oral storyteller would use to create memory markers. Like, that word rhymed, and now we have a word that rhymes like 2 minutes later, but reminds me of what we were just talking about. And the alliteration is used that way too. In terms of translation theory, I guess, people do it so many different ways. Like, one of the joys of getting into this is that I learned how many different ways people think about translation. Because there were times when I was like, what am I doing? Am I even translating this? Is this a thing? And I was thinking about, kind of perversely, I guess, I was thinking about the line in Midsummer Night's Dream where, and it's, I hope this is not what I've done. I've said this somewhere else. I said this and I was like, let me clarify. But bottom thou art translated into an ass, when bottom is transformed into a donkey. And he's, you know, he's been shifted. Fundamentally, he's different. But he still has some of the qualities that he had as bottom the man. So I really thought about the concept of magical translation, I guess, of the sort of folkloric concept of magical translation and the poetic concept of magical translation, that you could translate something into different words and different poetic idioms, etc., and still keep the guts there. It's still the same thing. The person bottom is still the ass bottom. Like, it's not, he hasn't become something totally different. He just has a different costume on. Well, and, you know, I thought about it that way, I guess. And that comes from a history of theater. It also comes from a history of writing fiction.
Yes, well, and I think deeply steeped in these epic traditions too. I mean, you've mentioned Ovid, so I mean, the magic of the metamorphosis, right? And what does that mean to have that literal transformation? So I love that that theory of translation, and I think we can take maybe this one last question, and then we'll start wrapping things up. You mention in the book the theory that dragons defending treasure can be understood as the sole survivors of a lost civilization. Could you explain that idea a little more in the context of sci-fi?
Okay. Well, there's this wonderful part in the book, the Beowulf poem, which is the lay of the last survivor. I mean, I, like anyone who translates this poem, am very badly in love with it. Like, in love with it in a kind of, like, hug it to my breast and, like, talk about it forever kind of way. And I wasn't. Like, that's not how I started. But it just, there are so many things in it. There are little stories within a story. And the Lay of the Last Survivor has no business being in there. It's, we hear the whole history of this treasure hoard that a dragon has found. We hear things that we couldn't have been there for. We hear things that we wouldn't know them. They're things that no one would know. So it's completely a poetic imagination. But it's a dystopian poetic imagination, because the last survivor of this society thinks that he is it. He's like, we're done. We all killed each other. We fucked everything up. And now I have this cursed hoard that I have to hide. And I have to, like, try to honor it by burying it. I'm just the last guy. And so I was thinking a lot about everything that has been written in the last 70 years, I guess, in terms of sort of dystopian, futuristic science fiction, where last survivors are doing exactly this task. They're on top of the pile of computers and the pile of whatever the hoard is that we have accumulated over the course of the 20th and 21st and 22nd centuries, 23rd centuries. And the idea of, like, imagining oneself into a future where everything is, like, equal weight. Like, the gold in this hoard, like, the goblet in the hoard that gets stolen from the dragon is as precious to her as anything else. Like, it's not like it's special, but it's very special. It's both things, you know? And so, like, in the sort of science fiction, futuristic imagination, that's often the case as well. Things that, you know, like a little bit of, like, match striking stuff is as precious to you as a piece of gold. And a little bit of, you know, a bottle opener, is a can opener, as precious as anything. And so thinking about the vast quantity of possessions that have risen up around us over the course of human history, as we are, like, wading through them all the time, going, I need more, and I need this, and you know, I mean, again, it's a long history of humans doing that and building our hills out of our hopeful hoards, building our landscapes out of them. So that's, yeah, I think it's a very science fictional piece of the poem, and also a part of the poem that, like, directs us forward, because the poem ends with Beowulf's funeral, and we get his guys grieving him, but we also get the building of his pyre, which some people feel is like a lighthouse, and I do too. I feel like he's like, make a light so that everyone knows that I was here, but I'm also like, And also, like, here's a place where something pretty bad happened. Like, here's a light on this monument of really a failure. An unsatisfying episode where you killed something very old, but you also killed yourself. And the thing killed you, essentially. You went running in at something that was a known disaster and decided to do it anyway for status reasons. So the warning is built in, and the warning in the Horde is also built into the Horde. Like, it's like, well, they didn't really realize that they were doing something that was just full of curses, but everybody's like grabbing up that gold going, we have to have this gold, but the gold is like meaningless. It's cursed gold, and it's Beowulf is much more important as a man than as a pile of cursed gold, but he doesn't feel that way. He's like, I'm an old man and I'm dying kind of gloriously, and it's part of my kind of the kind of dude I am, essentially, is a guy who dies by dragon. So he has to sacrifice himself that way. And I think that civilization-wise, we have lots of imaginings and lots of actuality about sacrificing ourselves by living too large, and sacrificing future generations by living too large. And I think that, here it is. It's like right here. It's 1,000 years old. That's the same thing that happens in this. So, like, if we're thinking about it as folklore is also science fiction. It's all, as I said earlier, it's all the same entwined corpus of story. Corpus of story.
Corpse of story also works and feels like a good place, right, for us to end thinking about what this old text has to teach us still today, and the important lessons that we continue to not learn, but hopefully that will change soon. So thank you so much to Maria for sharing her work with us and joining us in conversation. I'd also like to thank the Manitou Fund for supporting our reading series and supporting the McNeely Writer in Residence. And finally, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you.